Sally.
Hi.
Welcome to the fourth online talk on British Sporting Art, generously sponsored by Rowntree Tryon Galleries of St James's and Petworth. I'd like to thank Jamie Rowntree for supporting this project. It means that we can put on this programme of talks without making a charge. Today, I'm delighted that Jenny Hand, the director of the Munnings Art Museum, has agreed to talk to us on Alfred Munnings, Mansions, Parks and Lakes, the Making of a Sporting Artist. This is an opportunity for us to have a guided tour of the current exhibition and for Jenny to pick out the highlights. Jenny has been the Munnings Art Museum since 2013, when she was appointed as their first professional museum director. Before that, she managed collections and conservation teams in the East Midlands and the Royal Pavilion and museums at Brighton. Like Munnings, she studied at the Norwich School of Art and has a postgraduate qualification in museum studies from the University of Leicester. Just to add a couple of points before Jenny starts, Jenny has agreed, as Sally said, to answer questions at the end of the talk. If you have a question, the procedure is to use the Q&A button on the right-hand side at the bottom of the screen and type the question there. I will see the questions as they come in and will be able to put them to Jenny. And the second point, you might have heard at the beginning, we are recording these talks and making them available through the BSAT website. So if you want to revisit this talk or go back to previous talks, please do so through the website. So I'll now hand you over to Jenny and to Victoria, her cameraman.
Thank you, Tim. I'm so delighted to be giving this talk this morning and thankful to the British Sporting Art Trust for inviting the whole series, which I hope you're enjoying as much as we are here at the museum. We have ditched the PowerPoint in favour of a live tour of the museum, and I have, as Tim said, Victoria, my camera woman, on the other end of the camera. It does mean there might be a little bit of glare and jiggling about, so hopefully you'll be able to deal with that. For those of you who have not been to the museum is at Castle House, which is the former home of Sir Alfred Munnings. He bought the house in 1919 at the age of 40, and he lived here for 40 years with his second wife, Violet. They had no children, and it was his wish to open the house as an art museum for his work, which Violet did in 1961, and we have been an independent museum ever since. We own possibly the largest collection of works by Sir Alfred Munnings. We have 658 oil paintings and 5,000 works on paper, drawings and watercolours. The oil painting collection contains a lot of studies and preliminary compositions, which means that we are in a unique position to show the process that Munnings went through in the creation of an artwork. We also have in our archives around 2,000 letters, photographs and personal items, and all the furniture that you see around you here is in situ from when the Munnings were in residence. Munnings bought his house in 1919. He called it the house of his dreams, and it is 1919 where we're going to start our story with the exhibition Yours with Love, AJ. Here we have the painting, The Point to Point. Munnings painted this in 1919, and it features in an article in the Studio magazine from the October of that year. The critic talks about a maturing of Munnings' style since before the First World War. Though it is impressionistic still in its style, Munnings has started to develop a more detailed approach to conveying his subject. The subject painting was coming back into fashion, and the critic says, although Munnings is in fashion, he is not pandering to it. He is still finding his own style, creating his own style. This painting is very reminiscent of the compositions that Munnings painted of the hop-picking gypsies in Hampshire just before the start of the First World War. 1919 was a pivotal year in Munnings' career and in his life. In the January of 1919, he exhibits the paintings he did of the Canadian Cavalry and Forestry Corps in France during the final year of the war. And hopefully some of you got to see those pictures when they were here a couple of years ago. He also sells his pre-war Cornish works at the summer exhibition at the Royal Academy that year, which gives him the money to buy Castle House. And in the summer of 1919, he also meets his second wife, Violet McBride. And we're going to see Violet over the other side of the room. Here she is in a study of her on a bay hunter, looking as elegant as ever. Munnings met Violet. He saw Richmond Horse Show. She was an extremely accomplished horsewoman and very well connected. She knew the wealthy and aristocracy, which she would meet at horse shows, and her father owned a riding school in Chelsea, where he taught wealthy people to ride horses. Munnings' success following the exhibition of his war works and the connections that Violet brought made the start of this most high-profile part of his career through the 1920s and 1930s, and really established him as a good equestrian artist. Munnings in 1920 finds himself with a new wife and a new home, and yet the demands on his time for painting portraits means that he is away from home and his wife for increasing amounts of time. In our archive are 200 letters between Munnings and Violet through the 20 years, the 20s and 30s. And 50 of those letters have been reproduced in our book, Yours with Love, AJ, which you can see in front of you. Then Munnings writes back to Violet about the people he is meeting, the patrons he is working for, the difficulties he's facing in being in other people's homes and painting their pictures, but also really mundane domestic matters. In the first equestrian portrait we're going to have a look at, we're going to go to this end of the room and see Sir Raymond Green. Here is the portrait of Sir Raymond Green. The painting is very reminiscent of the pictures that Munnings was painting of the Canadian Cavalry and Forestry Corps during the war. And this can be seen through the colour palette that he is using, the blues, browns and greens, which he applies thickly and with liquid brush strokes. He helps our eye to go across the painting with touches of bright orange and bright red, which work in a rhythm across the surface of the canvas. It was fortuitous for Munnings that Raymond Green introduced him to Tommy Bouch, the master of the beaver hunt in Leicestershire. Here in front of you, you can see a picture of the beaver kennels at Woolthorpe, the Duke of Rutland's hounds. Tommy Bouch gave Munnings a freedom as a patron to create whatever he wanted to create in his time with the beaver hunt. Bouch said, "You shall have all the models you need, horses, hounds, men, all day, every day. You can stay as long as you please. I will find you a horse to ride, you can hunt, you can make Woolthorpe your home." Munnings had all the canvases and paints that he wanted, and this picture in front of you of hounds totally absorbed him in the way that he created the composition. He creates a balanced picture with lots of pattern. He says, those beautiful heads of hounds, their white chests, white flanks, and here and there a lighter coloured specimen with more white about him. The whole thing making a pattern. The background, the archway through to the kennels, the octagonal roof with its clock in the tower above. And so all else is forgotten. He was completely absorbed in what he was painting, the subjects around him. This painting across the room, which is one of 4 that I'm delighted to say are on loan to us, especially for this exhibition this year. This painting shows the hounds again, walking away from us, perhaps unusually. We are literally following them down this snowy road. This is a young entry at Walsall, and this is a study. The study conveys Munnings' impressionistic style, rather like the work he was doing pre-war. And then if you turn to the left, we find that we have a more finished version of the picture. The paintbrush strokes are slightly tighter in this one. The lovely blue crisp sky reflecting on the white snow below. And as somebody who comes from Leicestershire, it's nice to have a little bit of Leicestershire in this corner of the dining room. The following year, Munnings exhibits the 20 or so pictures he creates with the beaver hunt at an exhibition in London at the Alpine Club. You can see in front of you a catalogue from our own archive of that exhibition. At the exhibition, the publisher, Frost and Reed, recognises Munnings' work and asks him to work with them. Frost and Reed had been publishing art prints for a long time, and they first start to produce prints of Munnings' work of the Beaver Hunt series in 1921, and then they worked for him throughout his career, and they are still producing prints of his work in the 1950s, the last decade of his life. As Munnings was getting more recognised as a painter and commissions were rolling in, so could people buy prints for their homes, and so his paintings are getting known by many echelons of society. We're going to move into the next room of the exhibition. Here we are in the lovely drawing room, and for those of you that know Castle House, and for those who have yet to visit, the lovely bow windows look out on 40 acres of land in which Munnings and Violet kept their horses. In 1920, following a painting of the beaver hounds, Munnings goes off to Hampshire to paint the Romanies hop picking in Hampshire. Here we have a study of gypsy caravans. Munnings enjoyed painting the gypsies in 1913, just before the outbreak of the First World War and just after it, and he returns to paint them for himself at the end of 1920. The scene we have in front of us is perhaps a little unusual in that it has no subjects in it, no gypsy models are present, no people. But the study of the caravans has a very peaceful air about it, and the calm is accentuated by the soft tones of the colour palette. Munnings enjoys painting the gypsies so much, he says in a letter to Violet, "I've done better work than I've ever done before. No doubt now, splendid arrangements and such sun, I can finish with confidence and ease." Whilst he is in Hampshire painting the gypsies, he gets a letter from, a note from Violet to say that the racehorse, Rich Gift, has arrived at Castle House back here in Essex. Munnings had agreed to paint this beautiful racehorse, who was the property of Eleanor Viscountess Torrington, but he had not agreed a timescale with her. He was cross that the horse had arrived, which meant that he had to leave what he was doing in Hampshire. In fact, in a letter, he accuses Violet of arranging it. He says, "Did you get Lady Torrington to send her horse to Castle House?" But on arriving back home, he forgives Violet because he finds Rich Gift such a beautiful specimen of a racehorse. In this picture, which is a version that he painted for himself because he enjoyed the horse so much and understood and appreciated its form that he wanted to keep a record of it. And this is one of the earliest pictures he did of or portraits he did of a racehorse. The finished piece, which was with Lady Torrington, is much larger. Here in the picture, you can see that even though the horse has a dark coat, Munnings is using pinks and greens and purples to pick out the sheen of light on the coat of the horse. Rich Gift was painted in 1921. In 1922, Munnings receives a commission from Baron Robert de Rothschild to go to France, to Chantilly, to paint his racehorses and also his family on horseback. Perhaps rather disappointingly for some of you, we don't own any of the paintings of racehorses from Chantilly, but what we do have is this really interesting little study of oxen. Munnings had spotted a group of Percheron horses, lovely big white horses, on his way out to paint his commissioned works. He dreamt about those horses all day, wanting to return in the evening and paint them. When he did return, he found they had been in the fields all day and were covered head to toe in mud and completely black. So he goes and finds these oxen, which he then paints this beautiful study of. And he mentions this study in his autobiography, and his love of the French rural life is comparable to the rural life he enjoyed painting in Norfolk and Suffolk in the very early part of his career. It's a subject he returns to often, and one which he feels comfortable with. Munnings enjoyed the challenge of painting people on their horses, but he also found it frustrating. His patrons frustrated him. Unlike one of his artistic heroes, John Singer Sargent, who had oodles of canvas to paint his portraits, Munnings had to get the likeness of his sitter in a 2-inch square, like here in this portrait of Major Shackle. Not only did he have to get the portrait right, but he had to get the way they sat their horse. He had to get their horse right because they'd know if it wasn't their horse. In addition to that, they wanted to add in their hounds and their horses and their estates and far much more besides. Munnings writes to Violet of the frustrations of these kinds of commissions, though they were also rewarding. He writes and says, "I'd rather be painting ponies in the sunshine." An example of one of those very difficult patrons is the Duchess of Westminster, who Munnings painted in the early 1920s. We're going to go and meet her in the morning room. Here you can see a study of the Duchess. She was a very picky sitter. Munnings had his sitters on top of a wooden horse in his studio. He would often do this, place his sitters on a wooden horse. And then he would add in the horse underneath them from a separate study to make the finished picture. The Duchess of Westminster kept jumping on and off the wooden horse and peering over Munnings' shoulder, looking at what he was painting. She was a very fashionable lady, and it was the early 20s. She wanted him to make her eyes bigger. She wanted to make her figure slimmer. And Munnings was extremely perturbed by her constant interference. He writes home to Violet, "These riding women imagine they look entirely different to what they are." And so she is the epitome of the frustrating patron. Here in front of you, you can see a copy of the original correspondence with those comments in about the Duchess. And then Victoria is going to pan around the rest of this lovely circular Georgian room, because we have on display a number of the original letters which are reproduced in our book, Yours with Love, AJ. Here in the drawing room again, we have what I believe is one of the finest examples of the type of work that Munnings was doing by the mid-1920s. This is a painting of the daughters of Colonel Spender Clay, Phyllis and Rachel. Colonel Spender Clay had written to Munnings in 1925 to ask for this painting to be done, and it wasn't until 1927 that he actually was able to get round to it. which showed how much in demand he was for pictures of this kind. Colonel Spender Clay also paid £500 for this commission, which is the equivalent to around £30,000 to £35,000 today. So he was making a lot of money from this kind of portraiture. The painting is beautifully balanced and shows a honing of his technique, with touches of blue on the scarf and hat and the nose of Phyllis and Rachel and the nose of the horse, again helping to lead our eye across the composition. But it is perhaps pictures like this which earned Munnings criticism for being slick and samey. He was so critical of himself and always trying to make the best picture possible that he started to create what people might have perceived to be the same thing over and over. But he would have been working very hard to get pictures right for his patrons. We're moving on to our last two pictures now. Here is another picture on loan to us this year, which is a study for a painting called Why Weren't You Out Yesterday? It brings us back round to Violet, and here she is again, looking very elegant in the centre of the picture. The painting and another 5 or so in a series are inspired perhaps by his visits to Leicestershire and the beaver hunt in the early 1920s. And this painting and its companions were not painted until 1939. It's reminiscent of the kind of scenes he would have seen with the beaver hunt, but it's also based on literature. Munnings was an avid reader, and one of his favourite authors was Surtees. One of his favourite books was Mr. Sponge's Sporting Tour. And this picture and its companions are contemporary conveyances of the scenes that you would find in Mr. Sponge's Sporting Tour. In the case in front of you, there is a study for Cherry Bounce, which is Cherry Bounce is one of the Munnings' own horses, who's also used in the picture Why Weren't You Out Yesterday? And below that is one of Munnings' own ballads. He wrote poetry for most of his life and was supported by his great friend, John Masefield, the Poet Laureate. This is the ballad of Cherry Bounce and Old Brandy, which Munnings published in a booklet. And in 1957, towards the end of his life, he published a volume of ballads and poems, which shows the range of his creative outputs. We're going to go back into the dining room now for the final picture and possibly one of our favourites. Here we have, of course, the painting My Wife, My Horse and Myself. The painting title is possibly based again on a catchphrase from another Surtees character who always said, 3 things I never lends, my wife, my oss and my name. The picture is perfectly balanced, technically brilliant, with lines that cross the picture to create a perfectly balanced composition. By the time this painting was exhibited in 1935 at the Royal Academy, Munnings had been painting patrons for 15 years. In my opinion, this is a little bit of a joke, though it shows the things that Munnings loved: his wife, his horse, the back of Castle House here, a very rare self-portrait of Munnings with his art, holding his palette. It is quintessentially English, and Munnings is putting himself in the position of the patron that he has been painting for so long. This is a conversation piece. Is he making fun of them a little bit? Violet said in later life, Munnings was never such a good painter after he met me. But the art critic Andrew Graham Dixon said this is the most defiantly British picture of the 20th century. It is pictures like this that have made Munnings so well known in this country and possibly the rest of the world. And that brings my talk to an end.
Thank you very much, Jenny, and Victoria for following Jenny around. The rehearsals obviously work. Thank you very much. A few questions, Jenny.
Yeah.
One of the you mentioned.
Interrupt him. You need to turn your camera on.
Oh, I have. I thought I had.
That's
Right.
better.
Sorry. You mentioned that Rich Gift, while the racehorse was sent to Dedham to be painted. How often did Munnings work in the studio there with the animals, and how frequently was it on site, out with the beaver and Hampshire, as you mentioned?
From the things that we know, I would say he was out painting commissions more on site than possibly he was here. He did paint Rich Gift here. He also painted Brown Jack here in 1935. And of course, he would bring studies done out on commissions back to the studio to work up in larger compositions. But I would say that through this period that really made him in the 20s and 30s, he was probably on site more than he was here.
So most of his work is being done on site. So he's moving around the country.
He is, yes. He was an extremely prolific artist. When we're talking about commissions, he had mostly to be on site, creating the studies, which he might have brought back and created. As many people might know, he often created several versions of the same picture. And so he would be doing those in the studio, but all the material, raw material, would have been sourced from being on site, working with those people who were commissioning him to paint. And he spent time with them and had dinner with them often. And so, yeah, so it's a little bit of both, but probably most of the raw material would have been got on site.
How did he find his commissions? Was he actively out selling or just waiting for people to contact him?
I think, well, there are bits in his autobiography and his letters where he's in the morning room where we've just come from, opening letters and oh no, here's another commission. I think he was tied to it. I think actually we have Violet to thank. She managed him very well. He actually signed over Castle House to her in the year they were married, and she was a great PR woman. I'm learning more about that. And I think it was a combination of her being very aware of that and guiding commissions to him, but also the people he was meeting, they were then recommending him. So I think, I don't know, certainly as time moves on through the 1920s, he doesn't necessarily need to find work. Things are arriving with him because of the demands for his skill.
Most of the pictures you've shown today are equestrian pictures, with one of the cows in France. But from our chairman, he asks, is it true that Munnings preferred painting pigs to painting horses?
Well, in the early part of his career, he certainly enjoyed painting. He had a little white pony, Augereau, who people might know, who stood still. When he moved to Cornwall, to Lamorna, he bought a couple of cows because they stand still. He also painted pigs in Lamorna. There is definitely an advantage to painting cows and pigs because they stand more still than thoroughbred horses. He does talk about the fact that sometimes you'd only be able to, paint for 15 minutes before the horse was so sprightly and unsettled that it would move off. So I can see how the form of the horse, something that an animal that stands more still would have been more appealing.
A question here. Did Munnings have much competition during the 20s and 30s for painting horses? Or was he seen then as the leading portrait painter of horses? And were there any exchanges with European artists?
Yeah, it's really something that's difficult to ascertain. There are contemporary reports. I mean, people in the 1920s, he was kind of still in the early 1920s, he was still developing. That article I mentioned in the studio in 1919, certainly recognizing him as a painter with a style of his own, he did take influence from the Pre-Raphaelites and the French Impressionists and the Dutch school of painting. He was painting in that kind of British Impressionism style. There may have been other artists who painted horses, such as Lionel Edwards, that you know, but there are different styles. It's hard to know how he was, obviously in the circles he was in, he was massively appreciated, but I don't know how those people who loved his work then, whether they were liking other artists as well. He in himself was very much focused on his own work. He didn't often, though he spoke to students at the Royal Academy schools, he didn't have apprentices, he didn't have people working. He was very focused on what he was doing, and it's very difficult to pick up from the things we have in our archive, from his writings. He certainly talks about knowing other artists like Soroya on in his life, and Singer Sargent, whom he had great admiration from, but you don't get a sense of where he necessarily placed himself or how other people were placing him.
Yeah, was there any European influence? That was the other bit of the question.
Yes, certainly early on, he was taken to mainland Europe by one of his first patrons when he was still working as a commercial artist in Norwich, and was introduced to the French and the Dutch School of Painting, the museums and galleries there, so for certain, and he studied for a couple of summers in Paris. So there would be definite influence from the French, more modern impressionist painters, but also the older masters, the Dutch school, and things like that had an influence on him.
Do you know if he ever met Sorolla, and how would you compare them?
Yeah, I don't know that he did meet him. He does talk about seeing his work in London, but I don't know that he ever did meet him. I certainly think there's a comparison. I wish that Munnings had done huge canvases like Sorolla because they're absolutely wonderful and light filled. But I do feel that Munnings has the same level of ability to capture light in his paintings.
You've talked about Munnings being very critical of his own work, and yet he seemed to have an arrogance that belayed any criticism. How did that work? What was the whole story behind that statement?
Yeah, he was extremely critical of himself. He did, you know, an early painting, Lavenham Horse Fair, one of his first major large canvases. He was never happy with the colour of the green. He was never happy with the foreshortening of a pony he did in that. Later on in life, he writes in his autobiography, one of the last commissions he did for racehorses for Lord Astor. Again, he's talking about the difficulties of painting racehorses. Even after a very long and successful career, he's still talking about the difficulties of painting horses. And yet he does come across, you know, his views on modernism and the trouble he got into with his speech at the Royal Academy. He has this very fierce personality and very definite opinions. I think the great thing about the letters that we have been transcribing is that they show a very different side of him. They show a much softer side. They show him as a husband. They show him his doubts about the composition and the color, and his frustrations with the weather, and, you know, those kind of things. It's really interesting, because I think a lot of people, I mean, we're all very complicated people, but I think a lot of people kind of just see that later personality that he had as president of the Royal Academy, and his criticism of modernism, and yet, you know, he was not someone who just sat here at Castle House and, you know, lambasted other artists. He went out and saw their work, and he also was very critical of himself.
Thank you, Jenny. Just a couple more questions. What about his writing? How did that, you mentioned Mr. Sponge's sporting tour.
Yes.
What sort, and you mentioned Masefield.
Yes.
What were his links to writers?
Yes, I mean, he enjoyed books. In fact, he says, you know, if he had to rescue anything from the house, it would be his books and not his pictures, because books help you conjure up, you know, a picture in your mind, and that can be different every time you read something. He came from a family that was very supportive of artistic life. His mother played music and read poetry, and encouraged him and his three brothers to be creative. You know, so he was writing from an early age. He had his first ballad, the Ballad of Anthony Bell, published in the Field magazine in 1918, and he it conveys actually his sense of humour, and his poetry is, you know, very jolly. It's kind of funny and also a little bit wistful in places, but he also wrote a little bit of music. He was the life and soul of the party, hence the reason that there were arms on all the chairs in the dining room to stop you falling off your chairs when you were drunk, when he was giving up a good party. And he could remember poetry and he would recite it and be, you know, the centre of attention. So you get the impression that he was almost, you know, he couldn't sit still. If he wasn't painting, he was out in the countryside, riding or hunting or being on the river, and that his mind was never still, that it was always conjuring up pictures, and the writing in some ways more important, as important as the pictures that he put on canvas. He just has this mind that you feel was creating pictures all the time in whatever outlet that was.
And the final question, obviously shows a commitment to capturing rural life. Did he ride? Was he a countryman?
Yeah.
Was he an active countryman?
Yeah, he was born in rural on the Suffolk-Norfolk border, and his father was a miller, and he saw country life around him all the time. He was introduced to the gypsies who worked the land around the mill. He was fascinated by horses because they were always there around the mill. I think, he talks about going out hunting. He talks about going overdrawn at the bank once and having to go out and paint a picture instead of going out hunting. And he was very dismayed that he had to go out and paint a picture rather than go out with the hunt. So yes, I think rural life was at the heart of where he came from, of who he was, but he was equally, at ease in the big houses that he found himself during the 20s and 30s as well. But yes, definitely the nature is one of the core inspirations for his work all through his life.
Another question sneaked in, so this will be the last question. You mentioned that Violet did help him get the commissions. Would he have been a better painter if he hadn't gone down that route and taken the money and just painted what he wanted to?
Yeah, that's the $1 million question, isn't it? It's one that we debate here all the time. It's very difficult. It's very difficult to say. I think his style became tighter in the 20s and 30s, which made him commercially, but he suffered critically because of that. He would have certainly, I think, carried on with the subjects he was moved away from, the ponies and rural life that he was painting in his early career, but he wouldn't have had maybe the opportunities he had to paint. And there's this dual kind of feeling in him. He knows, in fact, his retrospective in 1956, he said to Humphrey Brooke, please, at the Royal Academy, please don't put those those horse portraits in, please use my landscapes. He did want to be remembered more as a landscape artist than perhaps a sporting artist. So it's difficult to know. I feel the subject matter would have been very similar, but perhaps he would have stuck more with the slightly more loose impressionistic paintings of his early career.
Jenny, thank you very much. And thank you, Victoria, for following Jenny around.
Her arms are starting to wobble now. And for anybody who wants a tour of the full house, we are doing a virtual tour of the whole museum next Tuesday, which we've put online, which is reduced ticket price for BSAT members.
What's the process of making the booking, Jenny?
You just go to our website and follow the buy tickets and choose the BSAT members ticket online. And we're doing highlights from the whole museum next Tuesday afternoon.
Well, that's fantastic. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Right. Thank you for your time. It's a delight. And we've had a number of comments coming through that weren't questions, but were congratulating you both on the talk and the camera work. So thank you. Thank you to both of you. Just to finish, this is to remind everybody that the next talk, as Sally said, is on Thursday, 16th of September 2021, again starting at 11 o'clock. They were given by Chris Caribaldi, who was the former director of the National Heritage Centre for Horse Racing and Sporting Art. His talk is entitled Architecture, History of Palace House, Newmarket, the latest research. Anyone who knew Chris when he was the director of the museum will know his passion for the history of Palace House. And he's now had an opportunity to further his research as he works on his PhD project at the University of Cambridge. I've had the opportunity to discuss some of the work with him and do some of the work for him and find out what he's discovering about Palace House, which, as everybody will know, is the home of the Packard Galleries of British Sporting Art. So he's working on the home of the current home of sporting art. He's unearthing new material, which helps our understanding of how and why Newmarket became such an important place in the 17th and 18th centuries. So thank you, Jenny, again, and Victoria, for your talks this morning. And we look forward to seeing everybody again on Thursday, the 16th of September. Please tell friends and family. And thank you very much. Thank you, Jenny.
Thank you, Jenny.